Unless your name is Ryan Reynolds, don't buy a Premier League or an English football club. One of the trends that I am really interested in is the idea of gaming and how gaming specific or gaming native ideas are very quickly becoming mainstream. It's a lot of that localization and that fandom that makes all the difference. The idea of fans and the idea of how we consume sports is actually quite similar from the perspective of if you strip away the names, the brands, and the players, it's going to look pretty similar. Like you have some sort of stadium where people show up every now and then. You have some cameras that capture some footage, and then you have some folks who make sure that your fans stay engaged. But I think where the nuance and where that localization comes into play, that's really kind of where the magic happens.
Welcome to the Diligent Observer from PitchFact. I'm your host, Andrew, and every week I share insights and strategies to help angel investors make better bets. My guest today is Geoffrey Cheng. Geoffrey is the investment manager for Comcast SportsTech. Before working at Comcast, he was lucky enough to work alongside entrepreneurs and management teams from seed stage all the way through the growth stage. He's been one of the first employees at a startup, worked at a media investment advisory firm where he worked on deals impacting over $750 million in total assets. And he spent time with dozens of startups as an investor, advisor, and ad hoc fundraising guru. Geoffrey, thanks for being with me today.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew.
I am super interested in just understanding more about this universe. The sports, technology, media, entertainment industry is not a space that I personally am super familiar with. So I have about 1,000 questions for you today. We won't be able to get to 1,000, unfortunately, but I'd love as a starting point, if you could just share a little bit about your background, how you got to where you are today.
That's a great question. So I started out after college. I finished with a computational biology degree. Didn't really know what I wanted to do with that. Most folks go into medicine or research. I've always been driven by the idea of impact, and therefore medicine was interesting. But I'm like, oh, it's a lot of education, a lot of money for something that I don't really know if that's going to be super fulfilling for me. And ended up working at a health tech firm coming out of college. So I was there for a couple of years. Worked as a project manager, learned a lot. But at the end of the day, it didn't quite scratch that itch of that impact side of things, like I was saying. And so ended up actually doing a 180, moving out to Los Angeles, worked in Hollywood of all places where it was, the pay was not it. But in terms of the exposure to areas that could have impact, I worked at a representation group for a while. So at an agency where we represented everything except for actors. And so we rubbed shoulders with directors, writers, producers, and heads of crew. And for me, that was a really interesting foray into the world of entertainment and culture at large. And that was very satisfying. But then realizing really at the end of the day, if I wanted to have impact, it's really more on the business side rather than the creative side. I was seeing how a lot of the deals are being done by folks at studios or production outfits, or the folks who are in charge of the folks who are connected to the business side of things, right? And so you mentioned that media investment advisory firm. I was lucky enough to end up working for a group called East West Ventures out in LA, where our thesis, if you want to call it one, was working with high net worth Asians in the sense of we were helping to really kind of develop bridges between East and West, as the name implies. And so we did everything from financing films to launching production studios to more traditional VC and M&A type deals. While I was there, one of the deals we did work on was to work with this app called Triller. And so you probably heard of an app called TikTok, but at the time they're running into a lot of questions around their business model and how they approached music rights. Namely, they weren't paying for music rights and they were content to rather just pay fines rather than pay for rights. And so we did an interesting deal where we took Triller, which was a comparable app. We connected the founder of Triller at the time, Mike, with a developer who built a really good algorithm to help with recommendations. And then we also brought over some industry heavyweights, i.e., we brokered some deals with the music labels. Where Triller is now, I think there's been a number of deals since then. And so it's been everything from MMA type things to celebrities doing exclusive music video releases on it. So it's definitely morphed out of kind of the social media exclusive space, but that's been one example of a consumer facing app that did very well. That being said, so that experience at East West Ventures, I think, kind of scratched that itch of startups, entrepreneurship, and really the world of investing in general. From there, went to work for a startup where the idea was, I think, is one thing to be on the investor side, and I had an inkling that's probably where I wanted to be long term, but wanted an opportunity to really understand what goes into building a successful startup. And so out of that, a buddy of mine, MD, PhD, Harvard educated, smart guy, wanted me to help him run his health tech startup. And so I came on board, helped them with everything from product development to brokering a couple license deals to helping them raise a seed round. I learned a lot, but it also confirmed my suspicion that I did want to be more on the investment side rather than an
It's a
offer.
different world. Yeah.
It very much is. Yeah, I realized I enjoyed kind of the ability to work on multiple projects at once. Plus, I think it's just a different type of skill set, that just a different way of thinking when you're in the investor seat versus just building one organization in particular. And so, there's pros and cons to everything, but did some consulting on my own, helped a friend raise a small single digit million fund to a number of small businesses and startups that I was helping with everything from business strategy to fundraising. And then finally ended up at Comcast SportsTech. So a little bit of an extended overview of that career so far.
That's super interesting. So the connection into Comcast, we'll ask a lot more about Comcast here in a second, but how did that happen?
Yeah. So Comcast SportsTech is a really interesting experiment that emerged off a relationship between the group that pays my bills is a group called Boomtown, formerly known as Boomtown Accelerators, and Comcast at large. And so Comcast Sports Tech is this program where Boomtown provides innovation services. And so they do a great job building out bespoke partnerships with large corporates. And so that's looked like everything with insurance companies to marketing technology to accelerators with Comcast. And so Boomtown and Comcast have been working together for the better part of a decade plus. And that good work has kind of lent itself to Comcast being entrusting really this platform to be managed by Boomtown. And so Comcast Sports Tech, what that is it is a strategic partnership and a really kind of an innovation platform, if you will, for a number of corporate partners, which include Comcast and their media rights partners. And so that's Premier League, PGA Tour, NASCAR, Notre Dame, the University of Notre Dame, and others to really work together to collaborate, to innovate, and at the end of the day to partner with startups that can help drive those corporate businesses forward. And so my role is basically to help them figure out with their business strategy on the corporate side how to translate that into finding startups that can really move forward the key areas that they're looking to develop.
Super interesting. I mean, it sounds like the perfect seat for you based on kind of the background that you shared. One of the things I want to ask a little bit more about is because I heard you use this word several times. You mentioned the word impact. That seemed to be kind of a key driver throughout your career so far. Can you unpack a little bit more? What does impact mean to you?
Part of it is, I think there's breadth and depth. I think breadth speaks to the volume of people that you're able to impact or have an effect on, if I can maybe expand that word. And there are a few areas that, I talked about film and TV and the culture play there. I think in sports, it's similar. This idea of sports sits at that intersection of culture, of community, of what it means to this idea of fandom and this idea of really a consumer. And so there's a lot of different ways to look at it. But I think however you break it down, sports is definitely like a high impact area when it comes to breadth. And then there's kind of the depth area where it's not always just the volume of people they impact, but it's really how deeply you impact those people. And so I think with this platform in particular, it's really exciting because there's multitudes of levels where you're able to drive deep impact, whether it's with the corporate players that we work with or the startups and founders and really helping them build in meaningful ways through partnerships, or really kind of the fans and consumers that because of the technology that we're building, that we're able to create new experiences, whether it's at live events at stadiums or in the living room, that you're able to kind of create deep impact there. So yeah, I think that's maybe how I'd break that down.
Oh, it's really interesting. I'm curious, maybe if you could give like one or two examples of maybe just the last year or two, like how you've seen that impact play out, either maybe a specific startup that was working on something or a project. Give me a couple examples for where you've seen the impact of a lot of your work actually materialize.
One of the areas that I'll highlight is with the startups that we work with, a number of them come into the program with a good amount of traction. And I think when I think of impact, one of the things that really excites me is the idea of we're able to really multiply the traction that they have, where it's not just thinking about numbers like revenue or numbers of clients, but it's really thinking how can we help them capture either a new level of client or really market themselves in a better way or just really 10x their efforts without necessarily requiring a 10x of their cost. And so one example in terms of impact would be there's a startup in our portfolio that they came to us with really good traction numbers. They've done a great job working with sponsorship analysis, whether that's influencer teams, leagues, or otherwise. And we brought them on board because we wanted to figure out how can they help analyze some of the sponsorship deals that we're cutting from the corporate angle. And I think that's a really interesting way, without going into too much detail, of this idea of what can impact look like in terms of opening up a new type of clientele. I think the other thought is also when it comes to like players and keeping folks on the pitch, there's a really interesting startup that we onboarded last year. What they do is they basically make, for lack of a better term, smart garments where it helps with everything from blood flow to it uses infrared tech to basically help everything from pre-game maintenance to post-game recovery. And they do a good job because it's everything from the athletes to consumers can buy their product to a lot of college teams are using their product. And so there's the broader idea of kind of creating this ability of you're able to access kind of the athlete experience without all the costs and whatnot that might normally come with that through, I guess, like smart garments and being able to participate that way.
Love it. Super, super helpful. So, Jeffrey, what are 1 to 3 things that most investors, say the average investor, don't ask about or don't double click on when evaluating a deal in this space that they should?
I'll segment my answer into a few different categories. So the first one would be if you're looking at, let's just say, startups that work in the pro sports world. I think it's an interesting market in the sense that sports is a very flashy, very sexy area where it's oftentimes kind of a marquee investment. And so what I mean by that is the world of sports team owners, especially in the West, is fairly small. And if you look at the average net worth, suffice it to say, the owners definitely have a net worth that's higher than mine and potentially yours. And so I think,
Potentially. Wow, I
yeah,
feel honored that you would add that qualifier.
yeah. But I think the one thing to consider is in the pro sports world, there are only really, let's say, four, maybe five major team or major leagues rather. Each of those have, let's just use round numbers, 30-ish teams per league. So you're looking at a total market where your max number of clients is around 150. You can add minor leagues and maybe developmental youth leagues, but the number of teams in this space is relatively small. And so when folks are building for the pro sports space, the first question that I really have is do they, from a getting quick traction perspective, do they have the right connections? It's you can approach it the traditional sales route, like knock on doors and build, but who is oftentimes more important than what right? It happens in a lot of places, but I think especially in the sports world. The other flip side is that growth can happen very quickly. It's once you are trusted and bought into by the NFL teams and perhaps by the league as a whole, the NBA or like other teams would likely latch on, assuming this is a sports agnostic product. And so it's on one hand understanding the ceiling is perhaps lower than other industries in pro sports, but also your pathway to get there as a result can oftentimes be quicker. And so the question that sometimes folks don't ask is really what's that go to market strategy and really digging deeper beyond the usual answers and making sure that founder really understands the space. Another question that I think in the sports world is interesting to consider is in the US, I think oftentimes VCs are preoccupied with this idea of finding the $1 billion unicorn, which is fantastic. You got to pay off your fund, you got to have healthy LPs, and at the end of the day, if you're a good VC, you're doing a good job returning money. That being said, I think there's a whole middle tier where I've been fortunate enough to travel for my job. And this year I've been everywhere from Brazil to Qatar to Asia to Europe. And the theme that I'm seeing is really this tier of highly motivated, highly financed sports leagues or sports operators and the ecosystems that surround it. And so when I'm talking the ecosystem, it's not just the sports team, but it's the fans and how you engage the fan. It's the media outlets and it's the sponsors and it's the stadium companies and all these other things that kind of spread around the sports ecosystem. But what we're seeing is really kind of emergence of, especially in the Middle East, kind of this emergence of political implications aside, I think there's really a legitimate clamoring for let's get high quality sports leagues that are localized and that whether it's local talent, whether it's international talent, the fact is that folks love to watch sports. Like I grew up down the street from a triple A minor league team. Like, I mean, I can never tell you any of the names, but it's a blast. We go out there, have hot dogs and run down the hill and watch some fireworks, and it's fantastic. And it's sports on one hand is all about like winning and yeah, I hope my Bucks like have a better run in the playoffs next year. But on the other hand, it's a lot about experiences and community. And so the
Yeah.
second question that I would add is what are your ambitions within the states, but then also like outside the states, and what are the ways
Hmm.
that we're looking at that, especially as the world is so globalized. It isn't that hard for folks who are well positioned, for example, in the Middle East to come in and kind of position themselves into the US market if they had the right introductions.
I think that's super interesting because globalization is a really interesting trend that's become more and more relevant over the last, I don't know, a couple hundred years. Something that's been really interesting to me recently is the hyper niche communities that the internet and all this new technology has enabled. And I think an area where that's particularly powerful is around sports, right? Like there might be some hyper specific way for you to connect with this team that was, right down the road from you growing up for the rest of your life, where you could just stay super connected, and that could apply globally just as well as locally. I'm curious, like, how do you see your entrepreneurs thinking about managing the like global community around these sports teams?
I feel like for some of our startups that perhaps are very much in performance side of things, the global question going global becomes a question of how are these international governing bodies such as FIFA, how did they respond to my product versus in the US, it's kind of a league by league thing, whereas going abroad, there's regulatory barriers there. There's also just the sense of what translates to a global audience. I think there are like a lot of the folks on our portfolio who build for businesses. It's pretty region agnostic in the sense of if you can manage data and drive data insights, you can probably do that with a Salesforce or Azure, which is perhaps predominant in the West, but you'll see similar Azure or Salesforce or Amazon type of services, if not those exact companies, as you go abroad. I think perhaps the bigger comment is, and maybe what you're trying to get at is like the idea of fans and the idea of how we consume sports is actually quite similar from the perspective of if you strip away the names, the brands, and the players, it's going to look pretty similar. Like you have some sort of stadium where people show up every now and then. You have some cameras that capture some footage, and then you have some folks who make sure that your fans stay engaged. But I think where the nuance and where that localization comes into play, that's really kind of where the magic happens, and that's what makes an Arsenal fan, and that's what makes a Chelsea fan. There's a lot of similarities, but at the same time, there's a heck of a lot of differences, even though on the outside to someone who maybe isn't in sports, it like all kind of looks the same. But I feel like it's a lot of that localization and that fandom that makes all the difference.
I love these two questions. Your first one was basically, do they have the right connections, especially if they're prioritizing the best of the best, these 150 teams that basically represent your TAM. And then your second question is, what are their global ambitions? Like, how are they engaging with the global ecosystem? Is that correct on your first two questions?
Yeah, and the second one, it's, if you're aiming for American pro sports, there's a set of conversations there. And the second one is realizing there's a whole world outside of American pro sports that is like equally, if not perhaps more value, where you can make a lot of money that I think sometimes folks don't always pay as much attention to. I think when it comes to sports and media and entertainment, like especially when you start to get into media entertainment side of things, there's definitely room for grassroots, and I'm a big believer of the founder who built his or her startup from scratch, and that's an inspiring story. But I think more and more you're gonna see what we have been seeing, and what you're probably going to see more of is really this idea of entrepreneurship through partnership, and realizing that the idea of just having sales and just having client vendor relationships, that's fine if you're trying to build an enterprise SaaS startup, which is fine. But in this world, I think a lot of it is if you're able to partner with, let's say, NASCAR or PGA Tour or Sky or Peacock for building your product or establishing those key PLCs or pilots. I think, especially in the world of media entertainment, again, when you're trying to get mass user adoption, it really starts probably with some of these cornerstone clients. And that's one of the reason why I was really interested in working at Comcast SportsTech, was because it offered kind of a alternative way of de-risking investment, where it's not just a check and a really strong network like a lot of VCs bring. No, a lot of brilliant VC operators in the sports and media space, but the one thing that perhaps differentiates Comcast SportsTech from just a check or perhaps another accelerator is really deeply thought out, and both parties are motivated to make some sort of business transaction happen, whether that's our corporate partners or the startups. And I think that differentiator, the question would be, what's your plan to establish key partnerships in this space, not just what's your go-to-market strategy in terms of how to boost your top line, but really thinking about who are the partners you're going to build with to get there. And especially in a world like sports and media where it's relationship oriented, it goes a lot further to have someone in your back pocket who has seen you through a number of different transitions or stages of your company or product, that when you go up to bat, that they're able to speak on your behalf, that I think can really make a big difference.
Yeah. Given your experience and kind of the specialization that you guys have in assisting startups with this kind of thing, could you walk me through maybe the wrong way to go about inking a partnership with an organization like that?
Yeah, I think it's similar to dating in a lot of ways. And bear with me for a second. And so what I mean by that is, if I am showing up to our first date like with a ring, like that wouldn't quite be right, right? So I think in terms of the wrong way to think about it, some founders maybe think about, oh my gosh, like I have one interaction, I have to close this deal, and I have to sell all the reasons why they would be a good fit for me. First off, like I think it's just like when you're dating or in just fundamental sales, it's really always thinking about what does your partner need and what are the ways you can kind of solve for those needs, right? And so making sure that it comes down to a lot of just frankly like human interaction elements of on those first calls as you're exploring things, making sure you're really being mindful of listening to what are the things that that corporate is saying, and not coming in with trying to rush the issue or force the matter, but what are the things you can do to set up the next conversation. Like again, with that dating process, the way I look at it is like you have a pitch deck, and then you have an initial conversation where it's probably some sort of making sure it's worth their time, and then they actually start to explore and figure out what are the ways to actually build out a partnership. And there's a series of conversations. And, as an aside, that Comcast Sports, like the reason it exists is to demystify the whole process and really make sure you're talking to the right person at the right time. But in terms of things that founders should not do, going back to your question, it's coming in very transactional. It's coming in with this sense of, it's do or don't. One thing to realize is their learning processes, and making sure you figure out what are good ways to practice that pitch, what are good ways to test things out and prove out your value in smaller ways, so that when you approach like that one client or that one investor that you really want on your team, making sure that you are able to clearly articulate the value, not just in a hypothetical, theoretical way, but you're able to point to smaller examples along the way. I'm sure there are other things we could highlight, but I think
Yeah.
I'll those
Well,
two.
I'm wondering if you could give an example like of a company maybe in the last 12 months that you guys have walked through this process with, and as much detail as you can share just to kind of crystallize what it looks like to do this right and like how you guys helped this entrepreneur who was probably figuring it out as they build the plane build a little bit faster.
One of our founders came with a slightly newer company relative to where we usually onboard companies, and so they did a great job, I think, explaining that they had brought some key partnerships on board that they had not yet brought on an entire league, but they pointed to, hey, here's some of the athletes who we're interacting with. This is why they like our product. And then really the enthusiasm of the founder really shared a lot to us in the sense of this is someone who not only has a good story, who's not only proven it out, but they probably have the tenacity and the grit and the wherewithal to push through a lot of the process that it takes to really get to some level of success. It also helped that he used that same charisma and he had an investor on board. He had a good plan to outline how he's going to tackle getting into teams and leagues. And then on our end, we did a good job of identifying who are the right people on our end to get feedback from. And these individuals, when they're presented with the product, they were really excited about it. And so just the way that that founder handled himself and was really quick at providing the right answers to our questions, and not just the right answers, but really he was able to back them up for us. I think that really gave us a lot of confidence, even though they were, to use your terms, very much kind of like building the plane as they went along.
It's interesting because so many of the things you're talking about, I think, are universal across all startups, right? Have enthusiasm, be willing to ask questions, don't come in like you know everything, right? Listen to the people across from you. I mean, so many of these things are just basic human decency, but there's unique value and implication for this industry given, to your previous point, the limited market size, right? Oh, there's only so many of these partners to go talk to, and so you have to be really thoughtful about each one. So a separate question for you. I'm curious, what are some of the trends that are interesting to you right now that you guys are watching closely?
I think one of the trends that I am personally really interested in, professionally really interested in, is the idea of gaming and how the gaming specific or gaming native ideas are very quickly becoming mainstream. And so let me qualify that a little bit. So when I'm talking about gaming, you and I are probably familiar with, assuming we're similar ages, Call of Duty and sleepovers and pizza parties and Mountain Dew and
The
staying up till,
glory days, man.
yeah,
Take
360
us
nuts,
back.
not, yeah. And nowadays you have kids like Fortnite and Roblox and Minecraft. And like that, very much kind of building off of that, there's the sense of, I think when I think of gaming from a sports media entertainment perspective, there are a few buzzwords that go hand in hand with it. One is the idea of high engagement, high attention. And so
Mm.
there's a difference between a game that I'm playing and a TV show that I'm watching. When I'm watching, Shrek on Netflix or whatever it is, I could be on my phone, I could be doing the dishes, I could be taking a nap, I could be reading a book, uh, any number of things. And Netflix or whatever group that's putting out an ad, they would never really know the difference. Whereas with gaming, if I'm gaming, there's some sense of I'm probably like running around, trying to hide, trying to do whatever activities you do in video games. But the idea is that my attention, my focus is there. The other thing that comes to mind is loyalty. Like I think it's whether it's a battle pass system or just this idea of leveling up broadly defined, whether it's Pokemon to Call of Duty to the newest mobile app that is exciting. I think this idea of a loyalty program is something that is second nature for a video game, but is something that we're starting to explore a lot more in ways that aren't just tacky. Like I think airlines have done a fantastic job of loyalty and attaching that to tangible value. I think sports and media organizations are trying to crack the code in terms of what does that look like. And then the other thing that when I think of gaming is that goes hand in hand with that is the idea of community, right? And so we talked about the pizza parties and that idea of everything from doing something crazy and then coming to school the next morning and be like, oh my gosh, Andrew, you'll never believe what I did in COD or Zelda or, Mario game. But there's that same idea that nowadays you have Discord, you have Twitch, you have YouTube, you have all these streaming platforms that You can argue how quote unquote real or not that community is, but the fact of the matter is, for example, Comic Con is a huge thing. Discord is a very huge thing. Like these are very legitimate connectors of human experiences. And I think what the gaming world does very well is it starts from a place of community, and it's everything from let's watch streams and just day-to-day interaction on these online communities that sports and media organizations, again, they're trying to figure out what are ways that we can reverse engineer community, and they have fans, they know they're out there, but what are ways that we can connect fans, and really it's a lot of what are ways that we can create emotional experiences that connect fans with each other, that connect fans with the team, that connect fans with our sponsor. That I think, in short, there are a lot of ideas that we're trying to figure out from the gaming world that
Mm.
are going to be easily ported into the sports and media space. That I think in the next 5 to 10 years, sports, media, and gaming are going to be a lot more hand in hand than might be right now.
What's an example of something that's maybe already commonplace and how you've seen that transition? You mentioned the airline and the loyalty programs. How are you seeing this like already in the sports world?
I think one of the ways we could look at this is the idea of community, and I think a lot of so let's just take my Green Bay Packers for example. There's mobile apps, and the idea is there's apps, there are blogs, for example, where it talks about Packers news or training camp, or in sleeper or fantasy apps, there's different interest groups. So if you're a Packers fan, you can go here or Reddit, same idea. And so I think right now, probably the most analogous sports specific community example are these pockets of interaction. But I wouldn't quite say, partly because of the demographic, like I would argue that gaming natives probably trend younger versus sports is pretty age agnostic. But at the same time, if you just look at a spread of ages, and if it's age agnostic, that means you're also going to have a higher weight towards older people
Mhm.
versus gaming and trending towards a younger audience.
When I think about gaming community, I think about Discord, right? Like that's where it all happens, right? There's other stuff, but like I could be wrong. You can correct me. But I think about one or two kind of key applications. It feels like it's a more consolidated space. Whereas when I think about that in the sports world, I don't see a clear like market leader that's just crushing everybody. It feels like there's a very fragmented ecosystem. Would you say
Yep.
that's accurate?
I totally agree. I mean, even when I was just speaking off the top of my head, I was listening Reddit. I was listening perhaps like the Bleacher Report Packer specific page. You have an app, but for me, I personally don't have like a go-to. I mean, if I want news, I go here. If I want community, I go here. If I am interested in fantasy insights, I go there. And I would agree with your assessment there.
I'd love to hear any words of advice that you would give to the average angel when their next sports related or sports connected deal hits their desk. Any words of wisdom to share based on your
Yeah, I mean,
expertise?
this first one is tongue in cheek, but unless your name is Ryan Reynolds, don't buy a Premier League or an English football club. Like, I think the reason that worked, to be frank, is, I mean, besides the fact that he has a brilliant business team behind him, but it's the idea of, I think the broader theme that I'm trying to get at is I think folks might have seen Wrexham and Ryan Reynolds and been like, oh my gosh, this is a fantastic way to make money. And it is, again, if you're Ryan Reynolds and have the media firepower behind you and have the connections to launch an FX show and have the connections within England to make sure you pull the right talent and have the pockets to make that. Like, there's a lot of different dependencies that their
Mm,
success is dependent on, and it's not just, oh, go and buy a football club that is the answer. In the same way, I think it's really important to understand trends and really dive into it and understand what is going on behind this startup that your buddy said was really exciting. You got to check it out. Hey, everyone's doing it. Like, it's similar to just any investment, any sort of business decision, whether it's investing in stocks, whether it's figuring out what school to send your kids to. Like, make sure you really understand a lot of the nuance behind it. And I think it's easy to talk in generalities like we did, but my whole job is all about really teasing out the fluff and getting into the core of like what makes this deal special or what makes this deal fall apart. And I think you don't really get to that level of understanding unless you're willing to ask tough questions. So Yeah, I'll leave it at that. I think my biggest piece of advice to angel investors is just really understand what you're investing in. And if you
Mm,
can explain it in very simple terms over the dinner table to your family, you should probably take a second before you cut that check.
love it. I love it. Is there anything else you want to add or comment on that I didn't ask about?
I think for me, like sports and media is it's really exciting. Like I think for me, it's fun and it's this intersection again of community, of culture, of consumer that, to be completely honest, is just a really it's a big privilege to be able to
Mm,
be at this juncture. And for me, I'm excited because again, it's all about that question of impact. And I kind of explained it, in pretty sterile terms of breadth and
mm,
depth. But I think at the end of the day, it's whether it's, I got into film and TV because coming out of I went to school in St. Louis and in my last couple of years, there are a lot of the protests around, whether it's Michael Brown or others in Ferguson and a lot of the things and conversations that were going on. I was realizing, hey, like a lot of people care, a lot of people are having conversations, but not a whole lot of people are willing to actually change their
mm,
viewpoint either one way or another. But then around the same time, there's this movie called Get Out that came out directed by Jordan Peele. And basically it's this comedic thriller and it features basically this black guy who marries into a white family and realizes that they're all like psychopaths and he's actually in some deep trouble.
hmm,
But, it very much conveys a lot of the psychological elements perhaps of the black experience in America. And I saw people coming out of the movie theater being like, "Oh shoot, like I never really thought about it that way." And
hmm.
the reason I'm sharing that point is for me, like I was realizing film and TV is bigger than just entertainment. It's bigger
Yeah.
than culture. It really is something that can influence and shape culture. But the way that happens is by shaping and influencing individuals. And I think in the same way that art and film and TV can have a big impact. I think sports, it's probably generally more benign than not. I don't think you're ever going to have a super deep, meaningful change in your mindset because such and such team won or lost.
Mm,
But I think in the same idea, like there's an impact on culture. I think there are a few things that are as even as an entry point into conversation as, oh, do you like football or what's your favorite football team?
mm.
Or like, do the Bears suck? The Vikings suck? The Lions suck? And then, most people will, even if you like strongly disagree, like it's not quite at the same level of politics. Like if I say
Yeah.
like Republicans or Democrats suck, people are like, "Oh, you insulted my mother." It's like, no, I
Mm,
didn't. But sports for some reason, like it can be very deep, but also at the same time, it can be very like surface level. And so there's that interesting like sports can do a lot without having as much negative exposure, in my opinion, if that makes sense. So it's just fun to be in places where I think their culture plays, and for me,
mm.
again, that's just very exciting.
I love that. And I totally agree. Sports and politics, very different feeling. Well, this has been fantastic. Jeffrey, thank you so much for your time today. Look forward to sharing this with our audience and look forward to talking again soon.